Welcome to the Debate Drills Academy. My name is Rafi Piliero, and this topic analysis will be covering the March 2021 Public Forum topic analysis about space policy. So, what we will do in this discussion is we will introduce this topic, discuss some of the terminology at hand, and then talk about some of the core arguments that can be read by the pro or the affirmative and the con or the negative. So after this, you will be able to understand the basics of the topic, have some background familiarity in some of the arguments underlying the Space Force, and also understand some of the arguments that you can make on both sides. So for starters, the resolution. Resolved on balance, the benefits of creating the United States Space Force outweigh the harms. So to really understand this topic, it's important to understand what some of the words within this topic mean. That on face, when you read that, you might be thinking, I'm not really sure what the Space Force is. I know this is a branch of the military that was created under Trump, but perhaps I'm not really sure what some of the arguments that underlie it are. But to understand this topic requires knowing more than just, it's a topic about the Space Force. Let me get researching. It's important to understand what these particular words mean and the way that the resolution is written, how it might divide ground. So, for starters, the Space Force. It is the 8th Uniformed Service Branch, which was created in 2019. When we think of the traditional military branches, we think of the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Army, and there are several in addition to that are uniformed service, but those are the four core military ones. But then there was the Space Force that was added in 2019, which was meant to take much of the space mission away from the Air Force. Traditionally, the Air Force the space has been seen as an extension of the air domain, which means the Space Force has been the Air Force was traditionally tasked with taking space as well, because space was seen as an extension of the air domain, that the Air Force is meant to try to create air supremacy and try to ensure that there is control over the air domain, and space was just seen as going beyond that. However, over a period of time, some people have come to argue that perhaps that's not the best way of doing it, that the Air Force has tremendous number of responsibilities as is. So, for example, they're the branch that handles most of our nuclear weapons. They already have to take care of a bunch of threats in the air domain. That tasking them with something in space is both just too onerous in general, but also not terribly related to the Air Force mission. That the types of deterrents that might be happening still terrestrially on Earth, but in the air, are perhaps different than, protecting satellite constellations in space, for example, or being able to try to deal with counter space capabilities. That those are very, perhaps, different missions. So that really is what animated the idea of having a new military branch, the Space Force, which would be separated from the Air Force. So that's what the Space Force is. It was created by the Trump administration in 2019. It is the smallest branch of the armed forces currently, but it is nonetheless a separate branch. So an important part of how the resolution is phrased is it leads with on balance. So a couple of things that really come from this understanding or this particular wording of on balance. The first is that it makes the resolution a lot more, the way the resolution is worded, on balance, the benefits outweigh the harms, it is more evaluative than prescriptive. So what does that mean? An evaluative statement is mostly just trying to assess, is this statement true or not? Has this been the case? It is much more backwards looking than forward looking in a lot of ways. That some debate resolutions are prescriptive. They are making a judgment about the future, as opposed to evaluating something in the present or past. So think of how the resolution could have been worded. The United States should substantially increase its Space Force, versus on balance, the benefits outweigh the harms. The former is much more prescriptive. It is saying, this is an action the United States should take. And the other one is evaluating a current action. So one way of dividing this up is that a lot of resolutions in debate task the pro or the affirmative with defending a deviation from the status quo. They are taking the status quo and trying to make it better. So if the resolution were to say, substantially increase funding for the Space Force, you would be saying, currently the Space Force has inadequate funding. Instead, it needs to be funded to a much greater extent. You are criticizing the status quo. In this case, however, it's not that way. You are actually defending the status quo. You are evaluating the status quo and claiming it is good. The benefits outweigh the harms is describing an already existing entity, the Space Force, and why that entity should continue to exist and why the benefits are good. So we are evaluating the status quo instead of prescribing a change to it. That is an important part of how this resolution is worded, and that wording is intentional. It does not say we should substantially increase the Space Force. It means the pro, or the affirmative, is tasked in this case with likely defending the status quo. The other important thing from the on balance phrasing is that it likely means that plans, or specific positions that try to use a subset of the resolution to prove the broader statement, are not topical. So, in some topics, you can try to prove the resolution true by appealing to an example. So if I were to say, the United States should increase its space policy, it should increase its space engagement towards China. You could prove that resolution true, hypothetically, by saying they should engage with China in the area of arms control for space weapons. That is a subset of that resolution, but it's an example of a broader statement that proves that broader statement. In this case, though, that doesn't seem to work. On balance indicates that a topical position has to prove the entirety of that statement. Proving a specific example perhaps does not prove, on balance, the Space Force has been good. So this is all a long way of saying that on this topic, specific plans that try to use an example or subset to prove the resolution likely are not topical. Instead, you are evaluating the burden for the pro is to prove, on balance, the Space Force has been good. And has been good as in continuing the status quo is good. Whereas the con might argue, actually, we should not continue the status quo. We should not have the Space Force. So, again, it's not about proposing a plan. It is instead evaluating the current state of affairs. Some useful terminology to help guide some of this debate, because for many people, space is sort of an unfamiliar area. It's not something you cover in a lot of your coursework. It's a fairly new domain in terms of, applying arms control dynamics, applying strategic stability discussions, etc. to space. So to understand really what's going on in this as a military domain requires knowing some important terms. The first are ASATs, which are short for anti-satellite. It's anti-satellite attacks. So these are basically anti-satellite weapons. Weapons that are aimed at they're weapons that are aimed at satellites for the most part. So if you see the phrase ASATs, that's what they're referring to. It's the attempts to render a satellite inoperable through kinetic or non-kinetic means. Kinetic meaning driving force into it, and non-kinetic is disabling it through some other means. So let's talk about some of these kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities. They are direct ascent anti-satellite weapons, or you'll often see DA ASATs. Other times you'll see it as hit-to-kill ASATs, or KKVs, kinetic kill vehicles. These are basically ground-launched weapons that strike satellites. Think launching a missile into a satellite. That is one of probably the most frequently discussed anti-satellite weapon. And it's the one that you probably think of most intuitively. You're just launching something from the ground into a satellite. It is ground to space. So a couple of notable incidents that deal with this. In 2007, China tested a direct ascent ASAT capability, exploding one of their own satellites, creating a tremendous amount of debris as a result of this collision. That was when China, for the first time, demonstrated a ASAT capability, or a direct ascent ASAT capability. They launched a missile from the ground, struck one of their satellites, blew it up, producing thousands of pieces of debris. There was international outcry. That's probably the most well-known example of a debris-producing incident or a weapons test in space. Another example was when there was a falling U.S. satellite, a weather satellite, that had been rendered inoperable. The U.S. used a missile defense interceptor to knock down that satellite to ensure that it was not able to spin out of control and potentially spill dangerous fuel on the ground, risking somebody. So the U.S. used a missile defense interceptor to knock that satellite out. Many people see that as demonstrating that the United States had a latent anti-satellite capability as well. The next are co-orbital. These are not missiles that are launched from the ground to space, but rather space weapons that are based in space and that can collide with other space weapons. That can collide with satellites. So co-orbitals think of it as a satellite colliding with another satellite. The phrase you'll often hear for this is space stalking, colloquially, or rendezvous and proximity operations. It is basically a satellite that loiters close to another satellite and forcibly collides with it. So unlike direct ascent ASATs, these are not ground to space, these are space to space. They are weapons that are based in space. And these are known as dual use a lot of the time, and they can be peaceful or hostile. There is nothing that stops a satellite from colliding with another satellite, but even if it has ostensibly peaceful intentions. So, for example, cleaning up debris would make that a peaceful satellite, in quotation marks. It is trying to clean up debris, but it can be repurposed to just collide with another satellite. Another type of ASAT, or laser-based ASATs, also known as DEWs, directed energy weapons. These can be based in space or based on the ground. These are not kinetic, as in they're not applying direct force through a collision, like direct ascent or co-orbital. These are seen as non-kinetic, quote-unquote, soft kill capabilities. So you will often use one of these to carry out some type of attack that can either perhaps destroy a satellite, which is the most difficult thing to do. You need a high-powered laser. More likely, you would just try to fry its sensors, or you might just try to what's called dazzle it, put light over an optic sensor to ensure that it is unable to pick up some key signal. So there's dazzling, there's frying the sensor, and then there's trying to actually destroy the satellite base itself. Then there are cyber capabilities, another form of the soft kill or non-kinetic capabilities. You're probably familiar with this from conversations about, stuff on Earth. This is really just trying to hack the satellite to make it malfunction. A great example was Russia at one point hacked a satellite to force it to rotate towards the sun, frying its sensors. It's basically interfering with the operations of the satellite to try to glean data or otherwise make it malfunction. And then finally, there's jamming. Closely related but slightly different from cyber, it is not so much a hack as it is trying to mess with the signal. There can be uplink or downlink jamming interfering with the signal that is being sent from it, and then uplink jamming is trying to interfere with the capability of the satellite to be able to function itself or the signals that come from it. So one of them is the downlink jamming is the easier task and the more common one that is meant primarily to interfere with the ability for data to reach its receiver, whereas uplink jamming is jamming the ability for the satellite to even send anything to begin with. A couple other useful terms. STM, or Space Traffic Management, refers to it's basically the set of rules that are in the process of being formulated or have been formulated again for responsible space activities and sustainable use of outer space. It's a term that is admittedly somewhat vague. Different people have different ideas. Some people discuss it in terms of the conditions that are necessary to be able to have access to space and safe operations in space, free from from any type of interference, whether that's physical interference or like radio frequency-based interference. Some people discuss it more as almost an analog to air traffic control, so almost the command and control of satellites, where satellites should go. But it's basically it's a large category of activities or regimes that are created to regulate activities in space. Then there's space situational awareness, which is really trying to have full domain awareness of what's going on in space, being able to detect, here's what's going on with these satellites, here's where these objects are, and effective monitoring. So this is something that the US and allies are currently fairly advanced in, being able to basically have full spectrum awareness of what's going on in space, monitoring activities. So, as discussed earlier, in this topic, the pro is the status quo. Most topics, the pro defends a deviation from the status quo. They propose a change to make the status quo better. But the Space Force already exists in the status quo. It was established in 2019 under the Trump administration. So this topic is not saying get rid of the Space Force, which would be how you have a deviation from the status quo. In fact, the most clear reading of it would probably be the topic is saying maintain the Space Force. The benefits outweigh the harms. It is not saying increase the Space Force, but rather, just on balance, the Space Force has been good. Which means this topic is neither a prescription, nor is it a deviation from the status quo. The pro is instead saying the Space Force in the status quo is good. Some additional background on the Space Force. It was founded in December of 2019, creating a new military branch. The reason for this was that the responsibilities had previously been held by the Air Force, and people thought the Air Force was both overburdened and also, perhaps, taking on responsibilities that were not a natural fit. If the Air Force's core responsibilities are being able to ensure that the U.S. can effectively maintain deterrence and assurance by having control of the air domain, that being able to both wage war but also ensure freedom of access for civilian functions in the air, that's a bit of a different mission than maintaining our satellites that provide things such as GPS or enable military operations to prevent those from being under attack. The Air Force already has quite an expansive portfolio. They're in charge of our nuclear capabilities and also maintaining the air domain. That space, yes, while it is an extension of air to some extent, it is just not really the same thing, and that disaggregating those responsibilities would allow the Air Force to focus on their specific mission, which gives the Space Force, which people have thought of as a military branch that spends basically all of their time just thinking about the space mission, instead of having to perhaps subordinate it to a less important mission than the Air Force's core mission. So the Space Force will protect space assets such as satellites and then work to facilitate deterrence. So as explained in the terminology slide, there are a number of challenges that are emerging in space. There are now entities that are able to destroy satellites, and the problem with satellites is that they are extremely difficult to build, but very easy to destroy. That there's an analogy that you'll often see that like a bag of marbles can destroy, like a $1 bag of marbles can destroy a $1 billion piece of hardware in space because of the ways that space is very offense dominant, that the ways that space assets are vulnerable just by nature of the high speed of everything in orbit, that a marble could take out an entire satellite. That as a result, it's very easy to destroy space capabilities, and the United States is extremely reliant on these space capabilities. We rely on satellites for military operations, we rely on them to enable various civilian things such as communication, the internet, the grid, etc. Without space assets, we would be much, much weaker. And the degree of reliance on space is somewhat asymmetric. People talk about an asymmetric vulnerability, where the United States is more reliant on space assets than other countries because of the degree to which our military is enabled through satellites. That this technological sophistication is a strength, but also a weakness because of U.S. reliance. So, why have a Space Force? Emerging space threats. China plus Russia aggression in space is putting our assets at risk. There is an increasing risk of attacks on our capabilities in space. That the Air Force is just not cutting it. We need a concerted effort and a military branch that can prioritize that. There are critical military assets in space. So everything from GPS, which has both civilian and military functions, to nuclear early warning satellites that tell us if a nuclear strike is impending. Those are very important to defend. People have written about how China's military strategy in a war with the U.S. likely would involve trying to take out our early warning satellites to sort of blind us at the outset of the conflict. So being able to really focus on the military deterrence mission is important, especially in light of the counter space capabilities that are emerging, as we discussed previously. Another argument is just that the Air Force is overworked. The Air Force can't handle this large of a portfolio, which you can make arguments not just about it undermining space preparedness, but it also undermines the Air Force's mission. Perhaps the Air Force now is less able to focus on deterrence in the air domain. Perhaps the Air Force is less focused on the nuclear mission as a result of this. That splitting their portfolio has deleterious effects on everything from space to air. But then, of course, there are arguments against having it, that it might be seen as antagonizing adversaries, that China and Russia might see it as the U.S. taking an oppositional stance in space or trying to weaponize. We're currently at a bit of an impasse in terms of what's going on with the space domain in terms of weaponization. So, technically, no country has quote-unquote weaponized space. Nobody's putting weapons in space, but because of the fact that space weapons are often dual use, where they can have peaceful or hostile functions, the fact that there are things like co-orbital, there are devices like satellites that can collide with other satellites and perform those co-orbital ASAT functions mean that many people think space is weaponized. And of course, countries have the ability to launch missiles into space, as proven by the examples that I gave a little bit earlier. So there's currently no real treaty to limit space weaponization other than the Outer Space Treaty, which is admittedly fairly vague. It declares space should be peaceful, it forbids the stationing of nuclear weapons in space, but doesn't say much about non-nuclear capabilities. So China and Russia have pushed something called the Prohibition of the Placement of Weapons Treaty, the PPWT, which bans stationing weapons in space. The US has not signed on to that, thinks that it was not a fair deal because it does not ban ground-based capabilities like direct descent ASATs. It only bans the stationing of weapons in space. The US the U.S. has signaled some support, perhaps, for a code of conduct in space that limits debris-producing activities and aggressive, hostile actions in space, but China and Russia have not been as interested in that, not really wanting a code of conduct. So there's been a bit of an impasse, and that perhaps the Space Force is seen as something that signals to China and Russia the U.S. is interested in weaponizing, which makes them more aggressive. Another argument is that it alienates allies. Number of articles have been written that the Space Force signals unilateralism, that at a time where the U.S. needs to be working with adversaries to find some solution, some space diplomacy, instead the U.S. has decided we are going to go on our own and just take a more militarized step. That members of the European space community, for example, might feel particularly left out. Japan might think the U.S. is leaving them behind. Some of the Latin American spacefaring nations, etc., might oppose the U.S. thinking they're sort of going on their own. Another is the resource strain argument, that currently we've been trying to make more of an effort to shift a lot of our space functions to civilian agencies. So, for example, space traffic management is being moved out of the Department of Defense and instead moved into a civilian agency such as the Department of Commerce to ensure that information about responsible space conduct, space commercialization, space situational awareness, etc., the information is more democratized. It is not seen as classified, highly secretive, behind sort of a military veil. So there has been an effort to move information that is relevant to commercial space entities, think like SpaceX, into a civilian agency. But perhaps the Space Force signals the U.S. is approaching it in a much more militarized way, which would undermine that. So, some pro-arguments specifically. The deterrence advantage. There has to be a focused effort on deterrence. The Air Force is not adequately dealing with the space mission. China and Russia are aggressive powers that are bent on using space to enhance their security and prosperity, which is zero-sum and undermines ours. That if China is able to knock out all U.S. satellites in a war, if Russia is able to, in a fait accompli attack in the Baltics, knock out U.S. satellites, that renders us much, much weaker and unable to defend ourselves. We need to have some ability to project deterrence in space, and the Space Force is better able to effectuate that. So, a lot of this will rest on a bunch of assumptions about how China and Russia behave, that they are probably aggressive powers who are bent on, whose interests are opposed to the U.S., and who will respond perhaps adversely to the U.S. trying to accommodate them. That the idea that this will deter them relies on an assumption that China and Russia are deterrable, that if the U.S. projects strength, it can get them to stop their aggressive behavior. Naturally, the Khan is going to be saying something very different about Chinese and Russian behavior. Perhaps they're not as aggressive as the pro seems to think they are, and that being aggressive towards them first by trying to weaponize space and create deterrence actually backfires and makes them more aggressive. So it's an important thing to keep in mind that there are several core assumptions about Chinese and Russian behavior that underlie the arguments for both the pro and the con. People often use the phrase, are they revisionist powers? It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it is still a frame that people use sometimes when discussing this. Are they trying to revise the international order? Are they aggressive? Or are they trying to be accommodated within it? If they're aggressive, maybe we need to show force in response, but if they're not necessarily, maybe they would become aggressive in response to our aggression. Another argument is this overstretch advantage, which was discussed before. The Air Force cannot balance both missions. Doing both results in perhaps taking away from their nuclear deterrence mission, from their air mission, etc. Some other arguments. Space utilization. That space has become less of a priority in recent years, has been underfunded, but a Space Force ensures adequate funding for these missions. It can help assist NASA with exploration. It can help facilitate effective commercialization of space, working with partners to, for example, host military and commercial payloads on satellites. That it can basically create synergy between the private sector and the Space Force to ensure that endeavors such as commercialization that have beneficial effects for the U.S. and the world writ large can continue. Some con arguments. No surprise, the emboldenment or deterrence disadvantage. That the Space Force, far from actually convincing China and Russia that they need to, stop being aggressive, actually makes them more aggressive. That it signals to them, okay, the U.S. is intent on weaponizing space, we better protect ourselves. That it creates a form of a security dilemma, where the U.S.'s drive for security ends up reducing the security of China and Russia. That it means they think that the U.S. is a threat. Again, you need to have controlling explanations of Chinese and Russian behaviors. You will likely not win this debate if the pro successfully establishes that China and Russia are already hell-bent on being aggressive in space. This only really works if you can establish, actually, they're more peaceful, they're more interested in accommodation, but the Space Force makes the U.S. seem like the aggressor. Other argument is the space law or space weaponization disadvantage. That there are currently efforts to try to negotiate, treaties and space law, basically that perhaps reduce weaponization, that create some type of feasible arms control to keep the peace in space, but the Space Force goes against that. It signals the U.S. is trying to weaponize space, and it violates the Outer Space Treaty, perhaps, which is seen as enshrining space as more of a peaceful domain. So this independently maybe causes problems, but it also hampers the ability for the U.S. to effectively, in good faith, negotiate new space law. Other arguments. There's perhaps an alliance's disadvantage. Other countries see this as the U.S. going alone, which perhaps turns the case because it undermines deterrence if we don't really have allies on our side, but it also has undesirable other effects. Perhaps allies themselves get more aggressive in space because they feel like the US has abandoned them or done their own thing. Perhaps they just are less likely to cooperate with the US on other cooperative endeavors, for example in the commercial sector or space exploration, that losing our allies would not be a good thing. So it can hurt diplomacy and cooperation. Finally, there's the resource drain argument, or the overstretch argument that I outlined before, that we're currently shifting towards civilian functions in many parts of space. For example, the Department of Commerce taking on parts of the Space Traffic Management and Space Situational Awareness mission. But enshrining that there should be a separate branch to take on more of this perhaps results in a tug of war with civilian agencies, which then pulls stuff like that more into the military sector, which prevents that information from being disseminated and accessible to other countries. That if we're saying information about where satellites are, that's classified, that makes it harder to understand what's going on in space for other countries. It makes collisions more likely. It means that there's an increasing information asymmetry. And finally, of course, there can be alternate proposals or counterplans, things that we should do instead of a space force. Perhaps we should just adopt an arms control proposal, so assenting to something like the prohibition of the placement of weapons treaty to reduce the risk of space wars. Perhaps we should adopt some other military stance, such as a deterrence by denial strategy where we work to harden our satellites to make it more difficult to attack them, to make them more resilient. So building more satellites, making them a little bit sturdier, hardening them against electromagnetic interference, etc., etc. So a couple of miscellaneous things I want to emphasize before we close for today. This is a classic disadvantage versus case debate topic. While there are likely some alternate proposals, the bulk of the debate will be, is the Space Force good or bad? There are certainly some reasons in favor of it and some against them. Which of those reasons is most important? There's not much topicality. The Space Force is a very clearly defined term, and that's really the only real term of art in this resolution. And there are not many small plans because of the phrasing on balance, which means that it really is just a core debate about, is the Space Force good or bad? The central argument, then, is often going to come down to, how do we respond to China and Russia in space? That there are certainly actions that have been taken that could be construed as aggressive, could be construed as a response to the US. Are they fundamentally revisionist powers that are trying to use space for their security advantage? If so, that might lead to one set of responses, that if not, it might lead to a different set of responses. So both sides need to engage this question about what motivates Chinese and Russian behaviors in space. So, in sum, come ready to understand terminology for these debates. Space is often not familiar to a lot of people. It's a one-month topic. So the more that you know about ASATs, about STM, SSA, etc., the more prepared you will be. But the core question will always, I think, be recursive, or repeating itself across debates. How do we respond to allies and adversaries, and how does the US want to approach space? Do we want to run the risk of seeming like we're weaponizing space, or is that necessary for security? Thank you for watching, and I hope that helps.